I will now pass on to introduce tonight's guest speaker. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Captain Alistair Cooper. I hope that you've read in the last flyer attached to the dog that Alistair's a maritime warfare officer who's enjoyed a variety of sea postings as well as shore command in South Australia as the senior naval officer. His work in Navy headquarters has included high-profile time as research officer for the Chief of Navy, and I should point out that means much more than just being good at Googling. His varied career also included working in the private sector and as a public servant in three departments: Defence, Prime Minister and Cabinet and Attorney Generals. Now back in the Navy fold, he brings a range of academic skills to his current posting as the Director of the Sea Power Centre, located in Canberra. His various responsibilities in this capacity include matters related to Navy's history and heritage. Hence the reason we've invited him to come along and talk to us this evening. Given the changes that seem to be occurring in this area in recent times, he's eminently qualified to discuss and explain the challenges that Navy faces in managing its heritage responsibilities in an environment of increasing budgetary restraint and a focus on delivering new capability, and what he foresees for the future, for the years ahead in this domain. So please give a warm welcome to Captain Alistair Cooper.
Microphone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honoured to be able to have dinner with many of you tonight and to be able to speak to you about what we're doing with Navy history and heritage. I should start by saying that when I was the research officer, the Chief of Navy, it was the custom of the Chief to have both watches for his staff and for the admirals. And if you can imagine a rectangular meeting room table with Chief of Navy up one end, admirals various, and then down the children's end of the table was his staff. And for the first few weeks that I was there, as the scene would go around and sort of ask people for what was on their plate today and so forth, and get to the staff, and we'd all sit there and go, "No, nothing, sir. Nothing, sir. Nothing, sir." Anyway, eventually I decided I wasn't just there for my looks. Amazing, I know, but I thought, right, I'm going to try and make sure that this lot learn something about history. And so I started out trying to say, on this day, and I would pick something that had happened in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, ideally related to something that was going on at the time. So if it was a capability issue or a maintenance issue, maintenance of Armidale class patrol boats seemed to be topical constantly. But I'd give them a 30-second or a 1-minute sort of bit on something that had happened on this day in the history of the Royal Australian Navy. Every now and then you could get to sort of doing a little bit of the court jester. On this day, Midshipman Ray Griggs joined the Royal Australian Navy. Sort of initial DO's reports were not promising. However, so a little bit of that. One particular time was fortuitous. The last known duel between naval officers, I think it was US naval officers, occurred on a particular day. And it was a time when things were particularly tense around a particular decision between a couple of the admirals, and so my contribution to this was met with, well, it's not that serious, and they went off and sorted themselves out. So I thought to start tonight, I should remind you that on this day in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, the 22nd of July, in 1945. Commodore Farncombe handed over command of the squadron to Commodore Collins. So, two fairly eminent individuals progressing their careers. And Also on this day in 1969, HMAS Brisbane, on deployment in Vietnam, had a premature explosion of a 5-inch brick in Mount 51. So there you go. So a little bit of what's happened on this day in the history of the Royal Australian Navy. And the reason why I tell that story for you in particular is not that there'll be a test on the careers of Collins or Farncombe or Brisbane's deployment to Vietnam, but my personal view of the way in which we use history is that the Royal Australian Navy has not been particularly good. We have tended to regard it as something that was old and dusty and you did when you finished or got close to the end of your career. And I realise that I'm talking to a number of people who are sort of a couple of years past your 21st birthday. So I don't wish to offer criticisms or anything like that. But I have taken an approach to Navy history and heritage that I'm really trying to promote the use of history and heritage as professional knowledge, as the experience gained from others that can make you a better problem solver now. That you start learning history and heritage when you join the Royal Australian Navy, and that it becomes part of your toolkit as a professional. So I'd ask, as I talk through what we've been doing in the last year or so, that you would keep that in the back of your mind, because it informs a lot about the way in which I'm approaching the use of history and heritage. The next thing that I would say to you is that we've set 3 goals for Navy history and heritage. And these are, well, I think the defence version of it has got to 4 goals. I preferred my original 3, but the 4-goal version is almost the same. The first goal for Navy history and heritage, funnily enough, is to support training and education of our people. So one of the things that we have done is, with the exception of the Fleet Air Arm Museum, we've rebranded all of what were museums as heritage and learning centres. And in some ways the content will be familiar to you if you have visited those places before, but I'm really pushing to say the primary audience for them is not you. The primary audience for them are the people who are going through those establishments, and I'm pushing my team to not regard what they do as just being contained within the 4 walls of the Heritage and Learning Centre, but to regard that as the base from which they can try and inject themselves as much as needed into all of the training and education that goes on at a base. In saying this, I should say we're somewhere here, and I'm aiming up here, so we have a lot to do and a long way to go. But that's the number 1 goal that I'm pushing people towards. It is in part a reflection of where we've located these facilities. A lot of them, with the exception of the Fleet Air Arm Museum, are behind the secure perimeter for a base, and so it becomes more difficult to get people who are not currently serving in. But it's also a reflection of my appreciation that Navy in some ways doesn't really care about its history and heritage. It cares about capability. Now, there are those of us who see intrinsic value in history and heritage, and I would assume all of the members of the Naval Historical Society of Australia would be in that category. But I don't think the Royal Australian Navy instinctively, organisationally, has that same concern. What it does care about is capability. And so I am trying to link history and heritage as a contribution to the current and future capability of the Navy. And my appreciation is that if I can do that successfully, Navy will end up wanting more history and heritage. It just won't realise that it wants history and heritage. It will want more capability. And if I can do that successfully, the resources that are necessary to do a good job for Navy's history and heritage are more likely to come, because Navy will see value in what history and heritage brings to it now and into the future. And in so doing, I will then be able to do good things for Navy history and heritage. But it's just, it won't look like it, if that makes sense. So that's the first goal for Navy history and heritage. The second goal is communication. Communication about what Navy has done in the past and is doing now. In the first instance, I'm really aiming that at school groups in particular, because the biggest challenge for the Royal Australian Navy at the moment is recruiting. We need to be able to attract more people to consider a career, and once we've got them, that we look after them and that they continue and are retained in service for as long as we can. So recruiting, retention, attracting people to consider a career is the first priority in terms of communication for me. I also want to make sure that we try and tell Navy's story to as broad a range of the public as possible. A lot of that will be done online. We'll also use the Fleet Air Museum. And when I talk about heritage repositories in a bit, I'll talk to you about the hub and spoke model that we are pursuing in terms of using Navy's history and heritage collection to communicate with the public. The third element of communication that I'm focused on is the respectful reflection of veteran service. So in everything we do, we try and make sure that current serving and veterans can bring their families to somewhere that, to a heritage and learning centre if it's open for a day, or to the Fleet Air Museum, or in our online resources, that they see a respectful reflection of their service. And in all of this, which is really going to the other part of what the Sea Power Centre does, we are trying to explain the importance of the maritime environment, of maritime trade to Australia. Because the purpose of having a Navy is not just for people like me to be able to drive ships fast, although that's a lot of fun. The purpose of a Navy is to actually do something useful and meaningful for the nation. And so, in a lot of ways, we're aiming to tell that Navy story, why we have a Navy, why it's important for the nation. We do that in part for that idea of an informed democracy, that Australian citizens understand what's being done in their name. But also we do it so that the people who serve, have served, and their families can see that there is meaning and value in their service. And again, it's all trying to tip the scales towards keeping people to stay in the service, because they see value, because people who they know see value in what they do. So, second goal for history and heritage, communication. The third goal is to be able to assure Sam that he is compliant with relevant legislation. Disturbingly, in this particular regard, there is actually no legislation which requires Navy to have history and heritage or to look after it. So there's actually no legislated legal responsibility towards history and heritage. There are responsibilities towards freedom of information, towards the Archives Act, towards movable cultural heritage, which really only applies when you are contemplating taking something outside of Australia. but there's no legislation saying you have to look after the history and heritage that you have. What I'm busy explaining to Navy, however, and in some ways the submarines are very useful for this, is the concept of social licence. And that while it might not be legislated, the Royal Australian Navy has an ethical responsibility as a national institution to look after its history and heritage, and that it has this important role in communicating what has been done and its value to the nation. And I'm happy to say that there is widespread acceptance of that, and the current language of idea of social licence is really the concept that encapsulates that in terms of the way we think about it. So they're the three goals for Navy history and heritage. The next bit I should talk to you about is sort of really a bit of organisational history, and it might give you a bit of a sense of some of the challenges that we are trying to address. So the Sea Power Centre essentially consists of three different groups, if you like, or three different organisations. The first is what was really the old Maritime Studies program, an initiative of Admiral Hudson with from the late 1980s, which evolved into the Sea Power Centre around about 2000. It was a very small autonomous think tank, really, there to write about sea power, Mahon, Corbett and the like, and support CN in his arguments for the Navy. In the early 2000s, an extra group was added to it, which was the old Naval Historical Records group. Many of you would know of Joe Stryzik, who was a stalwart of the organisation for many years. But the Naval Historical Records organisation was really grew out of G. Herman Gill's work on the official histories of the Second World War, and really kept, if you like, a curated set of records about the activities of the Royal Australian Navy. So that was all incorporated in the early 2000s. That took the organisation from maybe MSP was about 5 or 6 people. The Historical Records group were another 2 or 3. But until 2016, the Sea Power Centre was really a very small organisation, round about maybe a dozen, no more. In 2016, the Navy Heritage Collection was transferred from Fleet to Navy Headquarters and into the Sea Power Centre. I will spare you all the organisational details, but suffice it to say that it was probably not ideal at the time, and it created an organisation that, instead of being based in just one building in Canberra, all of a sudden started to have a national presence with people all over the country. And I think it's fair to say that as we have started to really get to grips with that, we've worked out that Navy has done an amazing job with not very much, but has also done things in a way that could be done a lot better, I guess. And as we talk through Spectacle Island and a few other things, I'll give you examples of the sort of things that I'm talking about. I should say at this point, because it will affect people who you know, or possibly you as well, is that it is very easy to interpret what I'm going to tell you as criticisms of what Navy's done in the past. Well, sorry, criticisms of the people who have put time and effort into the Navy's history and heritage. I want to be really clear I think the people who have, say, pick the Cerberus Museum, who have created the Cerberus Museum that we have now, the Cerberus Heritage and Learning Centre, have done an absolutely fantastic job. They have made the absolute best of everything that they've been given, and they've created something that we are building on. I do think that they were probably under-resourced, and so what I'm going to talk to you about has some implicit criticisms of Navy, but it is not a criticism of the people who have been undertaking that work. So I'd ask you to try and keep that in mind as I go through, because I want to give you a frank and unvarnished view of what we're up to. And I can think of a few things in the last 12 months where what I've done has been less than perfect. So again, we're not going to do a rose-coloured glasses version of this. In inheriting all of the heritage organisation, which I believe was under-resourced, it was also clear that it wasn't coordinated nationally. So the Fleet Air Arm Museum was different to what happened in Sydney, it was different to what happened at Creswell, Cerberus, let alone at Stirling. And as a consequence, we had mixed standards, let's just say. We did the same thing in 3 or 4 different locations, in 3 or 4 different ways. We didn't have a clear and consistent understanding of the stories we were trying to tell in different locations. So a lot of what I've been doing in the last probably 2 or 3 years is dragging the organisation together and getting it to behave as one consistent national organisation, where, for example, if we look at the Heritage and Learning Centre at Creswell, we're slowly focusing that on, yes, the history of Creswell, the history of Navy in the Shoalhaven, but also the history of leadership and management in the Royal Australian Navy. Because Creswell is also the home for the Navy Training Authority Initial Training and Leadership Management. So we don't need to tell that story elsewhere, we're going to tell it at Creswell. By the same token, we might have some common stories across all of our network. Why does Australia have a Navy? That should be a common story, and we shouldn't have to write that in slightly different ways 4 or 5 times. We should be able to write it once, do it well, keep it up to date, and have the same thing in each of our locations. The other thing that I've been doing is arguing for the resources to actually make this work. Without telling tales completely out of school. And with the caveat for those who've worked in large organisations, let alone government organisations, you can never ever be 100% certain of your budget, because things can happen in an instant and you can become a lower priority. But for the moment, we have been successful in effectively having the CPAR Centre organisation budget around about tripled in the last 12 to 18 months. So that's a good thing. We've also been successful in arguing for small numbers of people being added to our organisation as permanent APS employees, and then a much larger number of people who are being added in what we now call CERCAT 3.5, but is actually the Navy Reserve that you would remember. And we have a wonderful example just over to your left in the form of Commander Helen Ward. And they, Helen does a fantastic job, and she is just one example of how important the reserves are to us. But if you remember, I told you that in 2015, the Sea Power Centre was around about a dozen people. So we now have 4 full-time uniformed personnel, only 4. We have 16 APS, full-time APS positions, and then we have 81 Navy Reserve positions. So, of which we have filled about half at the moment. So we have an organisation that's not around about a dozen, but is actually around about 50 or 60 at the moment and heading towards about 100. It is a very, very different organisation to what existed even 3 or 4 years ago. With all of that, there are habits, if you like, that people developed when there was no money. And so the Navy History and Heritage Organisation is very good at knowing people, begging, borrowing, having a friend, finding things that were about to be thrown out, and so forth. We're not so good at spending public money in a value for money way. Not that what we do isn't value for money, but just having people with the skills and experience to expend public monies properly. And so that's something, it's one example of things that we are trying to bring people on the journey with, do some extra training, and get people to think about the idea that, notwithstanding the larger number of people, you can use money well to amplify the effect that a small number of people can generate. So getting people to think that that's an option for them, that we can spend money to do something good, to do it well, and achieve a value for money effect, is something that we just need to change people's thinking about. So a lot of the journey, if you like, is changing the way people think and thinking that actually there might be some resources available to them. They just have to actually sit down and make the argument. Alright. I should say as well, by the way, if anybody wants to ask questions at any stage, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll just put you all to sleep. I'll try not to have my soothing voice on. In the last 12 months, I think it's fair to say there have been some changes that we have made that are, there have been 1 or 2 changes that we've made that we have executed poorly. There have been some other changes that we are in the process of making that I guess are controversial. And there are some other parts of our community who have been unhappy at the way some other changes have occurred. So I'm going to talk through three main things over the next little while. The first one, and this is something that when you're looking for somebody who is responsible, I'm responsible. The Sea Power Centre website was, until about January this year, it wasn't really a separate website. It was a significant proportion of what was the Navy website. For a variety of reasons, the Navy website needed to be updated. Don't push me on all of this. So if there is anybody here who is really, really good with websites and that sort of thing, then I will be out of my depth shortly. But the platform that the old Navy website existed on was old. I think it was Drupal 7, and evidently Drupal 10 is the standard now. And so there was a need to be able to get it up to date. Allied to that, there's been a global defence change to having, let's just say, a far more cut down version of information on the public websites. So the new Navy website did not include about 80% of the original content, a large portion of which was attributable to the Sea Power Centre. It was always our intention to move towards having a CPOW Centre website that would have that history and heritage information on it, but we didn't manage the transition well, and so all of the information went apparently lost and forgotten about, not lost and not forgotten about, but there wasn't a smooth transition. I didn't communicate it very well to stakeholder groups like the Naval Historical Society, like the Fleet Airmen Association, and so forth. And there was understandable concern about what was happening to it. If you look now, you'll find that there is a CPOW Centre website that is, in fact, the old website, tidied up a little bit, and we are working on getting the information into a form that will be transferred to a new, up-to-date website on whatever the up-to-date platform is, either late this year or early next. So the idea that the changes that occurred were an indicator of Navy not appreciating its history and heritage, I would say, is incorrect. It is an indication that Navy doesn't always get things right, and I'm the one who's responsible for that, I guess, ugly transition that occurred earlier this year. So, all that said, there is still a need for us to tidy up and clean up what we've got there. I have, for example, we have people who have been, just pick the issue of senior officer biographies. We have a lot of them where people have their biography up on the Navy website, or at least used to, and then they would stop doing things in Navy and head off and do something somewhere else, and we would stop tracking it. And so the information became stale and out of date. We did a lot of early work in digitising documents and making them available to the public. Navy News was an example of that. In 2005, 2010, when we first started doing it, what we were doing was close to state of the art. By last year, those original scans were of poor quality. They're not compliant with the latest disability accessibility rules. And also, we had put a lot of information, we had helped the National Library of Australia, who through their Trove website create a really wonderful resource of newspapers from the whole nation. They've now done a much better version of what we'd done originally. And so I've made the decision that we're not going to keep our 15-year-old version of Navy News on the website, but we will point to the National Library of Australia, where you can get those things and have them made available. Another example is when I look at biographies, we had in the past been taking biographies from places like the Australian Dictionary of Biography and replicating them on the Navy website. Ultimately, I believe we don't need to do that, because those sort of resources, as I say, the original source for them is not Navy. The original source is the Australian Dictionary of Biography. And so, as we modernise our website, we are looking to make sure that those things that are actually available elsewhere in a credible, substantive institution are referenced there. And then those things where Navy has actually created the resource, we keep it up to date, make sure it's easily findable, and so the website, and the website actually has people and resources attached to it to keep it up to date, which is something which we probably needed to do more of before now. So that's the website. The next thing that we're doing is around effectively, it's effectively an infrastructure operation. Somewhere in the Royal Australian Navy's history, people have decided two things. First of all, that old things are best kept and displayed in old buildings. And the second is that old things that are no longer in service are not subject to the same rules of chemistry that things in service are applied to. So a gun, 4-inch gun, 4.1 inch gun from SMS Emden, sitting on the side of Sydney Harbour, where it's getting salt water and corrosion over it, doesn't need to be maintained in the same way that we would maintain a gun on board a serving ship. Obviously not true, but things that we need to change. Putting old things in old buildings is a really poor choice. Not only is it effectively not a good choice for the heritage building, because you need to be able to work on the building to keep it such that it'll have a good environment for the artefacts that it contains. But it's not good for the artefacts either. My criticism of the Royal Australian Navy is that at some stage we decided it was a good idea to put our heritage collection on Spectacle Island in a 19th century ammunition dump surrounded by salt water. Now, many of us have been to Spectacle Island. Sydney Harbour is one of the most beautiful locations in the world, and it is, quite romantic and wonderful. It's not a great place to keep a heritage repository. So I have now added to that, the maintenance of the buildings had probably not been as good as it ought to have been, and so about 18 months ago we had detection of lead-containing dust on the island and a fairly extensive lot of contamination. As a consequence, we had to shut the island down to routine access by our staff. The Navy cadets who had just finished or renovating a building also had to move off the island. So that meant we weren't able to maintain the collection or look after the collection in the way we wanted to. Over the last 6 months, we have started moving the heritage collection off Spectacle Island. Currently sits on 199 pallets at the Joint Logistics Unit East in Moorebank in Sydney. That's the results of the first phase of getting easily palletisable things off. If you've got HMAS Ovens as name board, that's easily palletisable. If you've got HMAS Wollongong's name board, not so much. So we've got more to get off, and that will be starting again phase 2. The difficult stuff starts again in August, and we'll be removing more from the island. We want to move to a at least minimum viable capability but fit for purpose modern repository. Effectively, I'm not a supply officer by trade, but I have come to view heritage repositories as essentially logistics. You have a range of different things with a range of different storage requirements, and you need a building that is fit for purpose for looking after them. Some things you have to check on regularly, other things you can leave for a decade, and you have to know what's what. It is essentially a logistics and warehousing operation. So I am looking to find and move the collection into a modern warehouse. There has been talk, and we have been looking at a building down at Williamstown affectionately known as the Big Green Shed. It was the former foreign military sales fit-out location for the Anzac class frigates. I think it's where their 5-inch guns and Mark 41 VLS were fitted out prior to being installed in the ship. Up until maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was told, a very good bet to be given the nod to move into that. We're not anymore. So that one is off the table. And we're now looking at 2 locations in Sydney. One at Banks Meadow, one at Randwick Barracks. At this stage, they're good possibilities, but I won't know for probably a month or so whether we will end up getting either of those. I'm reasonably confident, but I was also reasonably confident before. So I'm not going to count chickens before they hatch. When, and it will be when we moved to a new repository, this will be the basis for us to evolve our history and heritage operations to what I call a hub and spoke model. And that essentially is that I want to have a good hub, a repository, and then I want to have a lot of spokes, being relationships with maritime museums around the country, with museums like the Powerhouse in Sydney, the National Maritime Museum, and so forth, and that's where we'll start. But also places like the Huskisson Maritime Museum, the Port Macquarie Museum, the Holbrook Museum. So if you like, second tier or smaller local or regional museums. And the rationale behind that is simple. We as the Royal Australian Navy ought to know our history, know our heritage, but primarily we ought to be very good at being a Navy. That doesn't mean we're good at all of the different skill sets that are involved in running a public-facing cultural institution. It's different. What I want to do is have a really good relationship with as many of those public-facing cultural institutions, such that, if you remember my second priority was communicate, I can partner with them to communicate, to tell Navy's story in many, many more locations. Rather than, and I argued to CN that we should shut down the Navy Heritage Centre on Garden Island. CN agreed with regret. Why? Because each year we thought we got around about 10,000 people through that when it was open to the public. Most of them didn't come to see the museum or the Heritage Centre. They came to see one of the most spectacular views of Sydney Harbour. They would then go looking for a coffee and a toilet, and after they had found that, they'd realised they were next to this Heritage Centre. It's not a good spend of our time, money and resources. Added to which, Navy tends to use that place as a function centre. And there's need for that sort of facility with the number of different meetings and so forth that come through. But a function centre and a heritage centre are different things. And so we've shut down the Heritage Centre and taken the contents out, and they're also at Moorebank, part of 199 pallet loads thus far. We are not disposing of things. So this is not a, we don't want it anymore, we want to chuck it out. It is an attempt to, take the Navy History and Heritage Organisation from here and take it to the next level with fit-for-purpose facilities, displays that are presented to as many, or hopefully many more people. The Maritime Museum in Sydney gets roughly 1 million visitors a year, not 10,000. So we're working with them to help update the displays there, and we'll offer up artefacts if they need them. Another example of the way things that are changing. If you go back 2 years, we had one curator within the Navy History and Heritage Organisation. One. We now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And curators are the people who take heritage artefacts and the stories that sit behind them and turn them into displays that you see in a professional museum. So we now have a hugely improved capacity to make use of the Navy's history and heritage, be it for training and education of our people, be it for communication with the public. So we are trying to bring on board not just the curatorial skills, but the conservator skills that are necessary to look after the collection as well. That's still a work in progress, but I won't tell you how much money, but we've spent a fair bit of money over the last 6 months, ensuring that as we packed up Spec Island, as we packed up the Heritage Centre, we've had conservators on site, specialising in materials of different sorts, and ensuring that when we pack things up, we pack them in a way that's going to preserve the artefacts as best we can. And I think I'm happy to put my hand on my heart and say we are bringing the best level of professional skill that we can to that particular activity. It is being resourced. Yes, you could always want more people, you could always want more money, but it's getting more resource and more money than it has in years gone by, even 2 or 3 years back. So we are working very hard to look after the collection and find ways to present it to as many people as we can all around the country. Again, a bit like the training that I was describing to you before, I think we're about down here, but we're pointing up here. That's the goal that I'm setting. But as I say, I don't want to lie to you and tell you that we're there. We're looking there, but we're coming, we've got I wouldn't say coming off a low base, but we've got a lot of work to do. So that's the second thing in terms of how we're managing the collection. The last one that some of you may be aware of is that we've changed the operating hours for the Fleet Air Arm Museum in the last 6 to 9 months. And this is something else where we've maybe learned some things the hard way. About this, in fact, maybe 12 months has been the challenge there. About this time last year, the Navy Anchorage, the former Navy Canteens organisation, decided to shut down the canteen at the Fleet Air Arm Museum. While the canteen, I think it's fair to say, again, notwithstanding the best efforts of the people there, I think the canteen probably wasn't up to much. So in some ways we're not missing too much. Certainly the coffee was awful. But what it did is it made me stop and ask a few questions about the visitor experience that we were offering at the Fleet Air Arm Museum. And starting with the very basics of how do we know somebody's in the museum? How do we know they're safe? What do we do if there is some kind of medical or security emergency? And the answers for that initially didn't fill me with a lot of confidence. And so for extended periods last year, the second half of last year, I shut the Fleet Air Arm Museum. Now, we learned then that the way people find out whether the museum's open or not is not on the Navy website, not even necessarily on the Fleet Air Arm Museum Facebook site, but on Google Maps and Apple Maps and a variety of other social media platforms. So we had some very unfortunate circumstances where people were turning up thinking they were going to go and see a museum that they'd travelled the distance for, and we were shut. So that caused us, was my responsibility, and it did not go smoothly. We've worked those things out now, and we are in the process of, a lot of those reservists that I mentioned before are people we are employing to work at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, and they are focused on effectively visitor services and ensuring that when, again, with no disrespect to the wonderful lady from Navy Canteens, rather than seeing a civilian from Navy Canteens when you walk into the Fleet Air Arm Museum, you will now see a member of the Royal Australian Navy in rig to welcome you to the Fleet Air Arm Museum. And we'll have people as well, funnily enough, around Albatross there are lots of birdies, so we can find Navy reservists who have actually served in and worked on and flown the aircraft that are there. So we have at least 2 people when the Fleet Air Arm Museum is open now. One to greet people at the front door, and another to circulate around, keep an eye on people to make sure they're not doing the wrong thing. But also be available to answer questions and talk about the exhibits that are there. We are only open 3 days a week most of the time, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because we know that's when most people come to the Fleet Air Arm Museum. We're open 6 days a week during the New South Wales school holidays, because we know that that's another time when there's actually peak usage. But in doing all of this, we didn't really communicate so well with the Fleet Air Arm Association, and they were understandably concerned. So again, my responsibility for that. We have not been as communicative as we ought. I'm working on that now. So there's been a lot going on in terms of Navy history and heritage in the last 12 months. Maybe, and I'd argue, for a couple of years before that. It is in some ways taking a slightly more ruthless approach to history and heritage to say it has to have value to Navy now. It has to make a contribution to the capability of the Royal Australian Navy. But it's also one which we're starting to put more resources into and bring a greater level of professionalism to what we do. So it will, in time, I believe, make a much greater contribution. It will be used by a much larger number of people, and it will be sustained as something that the Royal Australian Navy does because it values what it gets out of it. But it will also, in valuing what it gets out of, be doing good things for the telling and the preserving of the history of the Royal Australian Navy. I'll stop there and answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Alistair. Very good. Answered a lot of questions and doubts, I think. Okay. But I've got 2 questions. First one is, albeit from a person in uniform, can you get a decent cup of coffee at the Fleet Air Arm Museum now?
Right now, no, you can't. What we've worked out is that, partly chicken egg arguments, but there is not sufficient foot traffic at the Fleet Air Arm Museum that will induce a commercial operator, even a coffee van, to spend much time there, let alone set up a relatively permanent operation. What I am doing is leaning on the Navy Anchorage canteens to install a much better selection of vending machines. So now, whether one of those will eventually produce a decent cup of coffee is probably a toss-up. But at least when you go, you'll be able to get, I don't know, a drink, a chocolate, something. And I keep on saying to them that I've been to Tokyo and you can get all manner of things you can get a hot meal out of a vending machine. I don't see why it is that they can't have a slightly more sophisticated or extensive range. So we're going to work on it. There are a whole bunch of questions, and again, I'm right on the edge of my competence, but I gather the kitchen that's at the FAM is a full-on commercial kitchen where you can prepare everything from scratch. But practically, we think that what we're likely to be doing is hosting events or functions there, and caterers don't need a full-on commercial kitchen that you can cook everything from scratch. They need a heating kitchen or something like that, which is different. So there might be changes in that front, but that's a way down the track. I'm also cautious, and again, this is a function of the hopefully growing level of professionalism. I'm told that foods and fluids do not mix with heritage artefacts. Even if you don't spill them over things, the crumbs encourage rats, mice, vermin, and so forth, which are not good for the collection. So if we do run functions, they'll be kept. We're not going to be you won't be able to have a candlelit dinner under the wing of G for George the way you could in the memorial. And so it'll change. But
Okay.
Coffee still coming. Second question.
Why did the big green shed disappear as an option?
So within Defence, the Security and State Group are responsible for spatial allocation of assets around Defence. Their judgment was that another use by another part of Defence was going to be a better value use of the facility compared to the Navy Heritage Repository.
Okay.
What? No, you go first. No. Well, I was going to say, hub and spoke.
Yes.
I get a sense from what you're saying that the hub will be, for the time being at least, the warehouse in Sydney, but eventually somewhere else. But in terms of the spokes and the ability to penetrate into the community around Australia, but let's be parochial, talk about Melbourne, or Melbourne, Williamtown. Do you foresee, therefore, that you could have non-defence owned organisations, and I'm thinking of something like SeaWorks, for example, being having a quite significantly increased amount of naval stuff on loan? Is it on loan or is it gifted? I don't know quite what that means, but do you see that that's possible? Because I might, just to extent, there's a push here in Victoria to want to establish a maritime museum. The most logical place in my personal view is in Williamstown, but not in the river. But because Williamstown is virtually there already. So what do you think about that notion of positive stuff in places like SeaWorks?
So the answer is definitely yes to build relationships with places like SeaWorks. In terms of the Navy's heritage collection, I think I would be fairly cautious about gifting as opposed to having loan arrangements. If there seem to be more 5-inch shell casings with the crew of HMAS Anzac listed on it from 5-inch Friday, then you can poke a stick at. And so if we were sitting on 10 examples of a particular type of artefact and there was an opportunity to gift one to somebody who was going to make use of it, then yes, absolutely, I would consider gifting. If, however, practical example, you're talking about one off, maybe 2 or 3 brass 12-inch firing pistols from HMAS Australia 1 that the War Memorial wanted to have in their collection. And I said, yes, if you'll guarantee me you'll put it on display. No, we're not going to guarantee that. I said, well, then you can't have it. Because in my view, the Navy was quite capable of looking after something like that, and we were more likely to make good use of it rather than it just contributing to the memorials collection. By contrast, there was a Silkworm missile at the dive school at Penguin, and I've organised to have that transferred to the memorial permanently, and it will go on display in the Middle East Gallery in the next couple of years. So we actually will, I guess the judgments about whether something is loaned or loaned permanently or gifted will vary depending on what it is and who the organisation is that might be the temporary or permanent recipient, and whether in, I'm going to say my judgment, but the Navy's judgment, and again it shouldn't just be me, we've actually established an accessions and decessions committee, and we have a collection management policy that we are working, that we've got version 1 out and we're working on version 2. So we're trying to make sure that our decision making is transparent, replicatable, that sort of decision making, rather than just being captains with views on things, because you can always find a captain with a view on something. Anyway, so we'll look at the collection in that way, but it will be with an eye to looking after the collection, be it within our possession or within the nation's possession. I'm sure some of you people, some people will know the people involved with attempts to create a museum out of the former HMAS Atama, where one of the things that I am conscious of is that ships are expensive beasts even when they're decommissioned, and so looking after, we don't wish to transfer items to organisations that don't have the capacity to look after them properly. So, and that is no criticism of the Atama people, because they aspired to do something excellent. But we probably, if I were asked again, I would want to see for somebody who was going to have a ship or a boat as part of their collection, I'd want to see them effectively underwritten by a state or federal government organisation, because they're, you look at the history of museum ships around the world, and bar the United States, where there's some significant money, they're relatively few and far between because they're difficult. So, and again, we're trying to bring that disciplined, professional, repeatable, transparent decision making to the way we manage the collection. But I keep on going, so Jan, and then in front and after her. Yeah, please.
Oh, Alex there. It's very interesting what you're talking about, material objects, I presume. I'm also concerned about the records.
Yes.
Where are they now? I mean, I'm talking about personnel records, etc. 20 years ago, when I started researching the office, I had to go into the National Archives. Now, most of them are digitised, but the problem is, these are World War II ones I'm talking about. God help the World War I ones. Halfway through the war, apparently, they started writing them in pencil. So now if you bring it up on your computer, it's almost impossible to read because it's faded. Now, are you responsible, will you be responsible for the preservation of those, or will it stay with the National Archives? Because I know, excuse me, there's been a lot of argument about the National Archives, getting rid of a lot of their records. And does that mean the Navy service records go? I don't know, that's a 64,000.
Yeah.
But
So
are you aware of the problem in that sense?
generally aware of the problem. There are a couple of things running through all that. First is from a modern perspective, and with the idea of identity theft and so forth, we have a far more restrictive view of the sort of personal information that we put up online. One of the most obvious examples is Navy lists, where we don't put them up anymore because names, dates of birth, etc., and being able to know these things about a large group of people.
That's current ones, so you're talking about, wouldn't it be?
Yeah. But if you have a Navy list from 2010 or 2005 or 2000, you can still work your way through the majority of the senior leadership of the Royal Australian Navy now.
Yes, I gather that.
So in some ways we're taking a more restrictive view of putting personal information up online. That said, and the other thing is that, again, although I've managed to successfully argue for the CPAR Centre to get more resources, we cannot and we should not replicate the information management responsibilities of the defence organisation writ large. So there are corporate data repositories and other ways that Defence manages information to comply with the Archives Act that the CPAR Centre follows as part of Defence, but for which we are not responsible. So I come back to almost the original concept of the Naval Records section. They kept a curated version of Navy records that were useful for the Navy's current purposes. And that's really what we're trying to do at the CPAR Centre. We can't keep every single record, nor should we, but we keep an eye on ROPs. We keep an eye on the physical record that we've inherited, and we've called them archives before, but they're not really archives in the true sense. We have archives, if you like, at CPAR Centre in Canberra. We had one on Spectacle Island, I discovered. We had another one. We've got another one at the Fleet Aero Museum, another one at Creswell, another one at Cerberus, all being managed slightly differently.
And are they specific to those?
They tended to be specific to those bases. So
Right.
Spec Island had a lot of technical information. Creswell had a lot about the personal records of people going through Creswell. Cerberus, I think, is a bit more of a mixed bag. Helen?
Ours is not in any archival system. It's bunches of photographs and records that are just all shoved into filing cabinets that need sorting, and we've got no idea what a lot of the things are.
Yeah.
So I would be calling it an archive is a very
Yeah,
generous term for filing cabinets full of records.
So we're certainly
There's a
keen
lot
to
of
be,
work for you to do.
yes, distinctly.
And thank you very much for sending me photos in a hurry. I hadn't realised when I asked that you had all this going on in the background, but I appreciate it. I think it's about 2 years ago.
It's all good.
I've depended on the CPAR Centre.
Ma'am,
One thing that really stuck in my mind when Ken and I went to Pearl Harbor and had a look at the museum there was the fact that there were veterans there that you could talk to, and that was pretty amazing to see all these veterans sitting around and just wanting to communicate with people about their experiences. I was just wondering if you factored that into what you're doing.
yes, in short answer, I would guess put a lot of that under the guise of having a good volunteer program. There are a couple of aspects to that where it may or may not surprise you to know that we're trying to renovate things a bit. on the policy front, it turns out that Defence does not actually have a policy for the employment of volunteers. We have, because the closest thing we've got is the cadet organisations have some policy there, but most of the cadet leadership are actually paid, or paid a small stipend. So we are working with Army and Air Force, and I should add, we're working with Army and Air Force more generally to try and do those things that are common across a lot of us so that we can be more efficient. But we're working with Army and Air Force to develop a volunteers policy that will be appropriate for history and heritage organisations. And the aspiration is absolutely to have one that's there. But we also want to bring with it, again, a degree of professionalism. If you go to Kings Park in Perth and have a tour there, the volunteer who gives you the tour has had to effectively qualify to be able to do it and maintain currency for doing it, and they get checked every now and then. So we want to do, without making it impossible, we want to make sure that volunteers are equipped, knowledgeable, and able to add to that experience. So yes, we do want to, but we've got something else where I think volunteers will be fine. We collectively are about here and pointing there. So that's where I'm with that. But yes, I agree. We'll come back to in two ticks. So
thanks, Alistair, and commend you on the presentation. I think certainly come as a pleasing knowledge that this has been led. I'm particularly proud and humbled to think that the Labour RSL has been able to furnish what the Naval Historical Society is all about and is doing. But and I was pleased you touched on it, my belief is, you mentioned the veterans' family.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult nowadays to get a veteran to join an RSL. And I don't like using the word young because that's just a brand. Therefore, the Iraq, Afghanistan, let's put it that way, veteran. But in many instances, when they do join, the whole family comes with. And immediately the friends come along with that as well. Now, I'm so pleased to be sitting next to Terry and knowing from the headquarters as a house, this could be taken further and then disseminated back down to the RSLs that do have the naval connection. So Warramunga restaurant is an absolutely pleasing draw card, one. Two, the fact that we do meet upstairs here is what I think is all about. So for as long as I'm around, I'm happy to facilitate anything that you may have or that your team may have in education going forward. And I hope that you've got that feeling tonight after sitting next to the exhibition.
definitely, I like the cabinets.
And it's also very pleasing to know that Michael Newton did visit and dedicated the drum on the wall. And so we've got folk visiting from that type of calibre and all the way through, hey, this is what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen. You're doing a great job.
You are indeed, thank you.
Can I add just something else there, sir? Because I can put my hat on as the past president of an RSL and my work that I'm doing with the regional RSLs to loan more of our artefacts out so they're not green machines. It doesn't matter if they're not here to see. This year alone we've loaned artefacts to Ararat RSL, Bendigo RSL, Echuca RSL, Mullever RSL, so that they can tell the stories behind the things that we've got. So that's a task I will do more of now that I am relieved of being the manager of the Heritage and Learning Centre as of today, I can get out and do, but that's what we want. It costs us money to put things in storage. It does no one any value to have them sitting in storage when we can refresh the shrine, we can refresh the Phillip Island National Vietnam Veterans Museum. We can do those things because we don't want them sitting on a shelf where no one gets to see them, and we have to pay money for that when they can be out there hitting those targets of our primary audiences that we want to do. So there is a lot of work going on, but you probably don't see it unless you probably visit some of those services. And we're not very good at blowing our trump. We probably need to get more articles into the Bendigo Advertiser, the Riverine Herald, and the Ararat Times to say, hey, we've done these things, and it's an anniversary of HMAS Bendigo 1 doing something in Bendigo 2. Come down and have a look at this, and while you're there, have a meal or check out the RSL, working with the RSLs to do that.
You've got a big job ahead of you now, so there's still more RSLs.
We've got to manage it too, because we only have a few people, so we can't have 500 RSLs coming saying we want the barrel that's relevant to our area, because we're going to find it in those 199 pallets and then work out a loan agreement and shipping and all that kind of thing. So it's at low key at the moment because it's manageable for the number of staff. That's the deal.
Small steps.
Alistair, I've always had an interest in museums. Now, I've had the privilege of going through the Cerberus Museum on a non-open day and spending about an hour there, and I thought it was wondrous. But if I want to see the museum at Cerberus properly, is the only way that I can do it, speaking as a civilian and not ex-RAN, is to go there on a public open day and just spend the whole day in the museum.
You could do it on an open day, however, we have, is it once a month?
Yeah. Once a month, because of the restricted staffing we've got, and we're an operational base, so you have to get behind the wire to get on there. We dedicate the first Wednesday of every month, because that's when I've got the most staff there to open and look after and answer the questions, to full bus loads of people, because the west gate to the actual Heritage and Learning Centre, it's about 1,500 metres, and I only have 2 or 3 staff on any one day, so I can't have you turning up in one car, and then Bob turning up 15 minutes later, and then somebody else, because I just don't have the facilities to get there and escort you backwards and forwards, so we can get a whole group on a bus, and we've done a lot of University of the Third Age groups this year, a lot of RSLs have come in as well, and we can do them in full bus loads. It makes it easier just because we don't have the staff to do it. And we have had an open day each of the last 2 years, in 2023 and 2024, where people can come and have a look at it. But I appreciate what you're saying. It's just a matter of logistics of getting people in that west gate through the security clearance and all the paperwork that goes behind that, and then getting you into the Heritage and Learning Centre. And then when you've had enough, you might want to spend the whole day. But Bob that came in the car after you only wants to spend 15 minutes because he wanted to see the honour board with his name or his grandfather's name was on it when he was IYC at the weapons school or something like that. And then we have to get him back to the gate, but keep him looking after you. And there's other people that want to see the chapels, which are connected pretty much. So we're allowed to have visitors across Heritage and Learning Centre and the 2 chapels there, which is spread out as well. It's 100 and something metres between all of those. So you can see how quickly the staff get used. And then someone wants to go to the toilet, well, that's not in the building as well, it's somewhere else. And then they want a cup of coffee, well, no, can't offer that either. So it's, I can appreciate that, but at the moment, it's just one Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every month except January, because that's when it's the reduced service period for that.
And Helen has actually sort of fought to actually make that happen as well. Probably pushed me to allow that to happen. The thing is, essentially, we created facilities in a different age when we had a different view of security on operational basis.
Before September 11, this museum was created in the 1980s, and once September 11 happened in 2001, everything shut down, and it just made it so much harder to get in there. And we haven't had, we're building the staff numbers up. I've actually got more staff now than I've ever had, I've also got more classes coming through recruit school than I've ever had, and they're the priorities, as Sir said, in getting training so that they can go off and be better sailors in the Navy.
But you know, if I've managed to find the right size batteries to put in the magic wand, my vision would be that you'll be going to maybe to SeaWorks and having an experience there that is hopefully better and richer because it's actually part of a facility that's designed to be public facing, and it tells the story of the Royal Australian Navy, tells the story of Cerberus, and so you can go there and it'll sell decent coffee, or yeah, there's a nice pub over the road. Whereas increasingly Cerberus will become focused on, let's say, a heritage and learning centre, and focused on training and educating the sailors who pass through. And so it'll evolve in a different way, but hopefully you'll still be able to get that museum experience you like. On the one hand, I acknowledge everybody's right to write to whomever they wish to write to and express concern about things. On the other hand, from a Navy history and heritage community perspective, my observation is that the community, if you like, is diminished as a result of the last 12 months. Because in the Navy hierarchy's mind, the only time they hear about it is when there's a problem. Now, never waste a good crisis. You can always fix something. And in some ways, again, it's a reflection on me not having brought people on the journey that sort of things happened. But could I ask that, you know, maybe before anybody writes to the chief in future, could I ask you to consider a couple of things? First is that if you see that we're not doing something, or if you think we're getting something wrong, I would happily hear from you, because I don't know everything, never will, and I'm very happy to learn. I won't make promises that I'll do everything you suggest, but at the very least, I'll give people a very good listening to. The second bit is, irrespective of anything that might need improvement, if you see something that Navy History and Heritage is doing well, could you write to the chief as well and tell him that his Navy is doing something well, because I think it's that whole idea of positive reinforcement. Far be it for me to suggest that admirals are a bit like children, but positive reinforcement around things that are going well is a good thing, because ultimately what I want for the Navy to see is to see that it gets value out of its history and heritage activities, and it will only see that if people are writing to them saying, I saw this and it was really good. And I'll give you an example of something that happened. Helen's Patch, a month or two ago, a photo was taken of a new recruit class in the Cerberus Heritage and Learning Centre receiving a lecture on the history of the Royal Australian Navy. And they're all there in their pyjama suits, the MMPUs, all engaging in that particular lesson. And I don't know who took the photo, but somebody took the photo and I put it up in the sort of the weekly report to the chief, and we go, BZ, that's really good. So
I took it, sir. It's on
my phone. Thank you.
Because I wanted our young staff to get recognition.
Yeah.
We do have people in their 20s actually working in our heritage and learning
which has
centre.
been great.
Yeah, that was key about doing that.
So could I ask and say, if without say constraining anything that you might wish to do, if you see something wrong, tell me. If you see something good, tell the chief. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating dissertation that I think explained to us very clearly your vision for the way forward. I think we all have a clear understanding of the challenges we face in achieving it. getting from there. I'm mindful of the fact that there are a number of people in the audience here who have devoted a fair bit of time to the volunteering process of the Cerberus Heritage and Learning Centre, as it's now called. So in some ways we are collectively invested in wanting to see a good solution and outcome for the future. I'm not pretending we want to get into the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry. I think we in Melbourne are not as well placed as they are in Sydney in order to convey the Navy message. We don't have a permanent ship presence here. We're cobbling it together a bit. I still think Williamstown's the best place to do it. But I think your presentation this evening has been fascinating. I'm impressed that you've achieved it all without any notes whatsoever. Clearly you're on top of the game. And clearly you have an impressive vision of where we need to go to solve the problem. I've got a number of questions that I'd like to ask, but I think we could go on all evening. But thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation.